Hi listeners, Jason here. We are excited to finally announce registrations for the biggest psych health and safety community event ever. The inaugural The Psych Health and Safety Conference will be held at the Sofitel Wentworth, Sydney, June 19 to 20, 2024, and offer concurrent virtual attendance. It'll feature live podcast recordings with OG researchers including Christina Maslach and Michael Leiter of Burnout fame, Psych Health and Safety USA podcast host I. David Daniels, Australian super experts including the likes of David Burrows, a special 10-year anniversary integrated approaches to workplace mental health panel with authors Tony LaMontagne, Angela Martin and Kat Page, hand-picked case studies from organisations doing it well, and a very special interview with plaintiff Zaggy Kozarov by Catherine Dunlop on that High Court case which we previously covered on the podcast. This event will sell out. Get in quick to secure tickets at early bird prices for the 2-day conference, pre-conference masterclasses, and the VIP dinner. The first 200 in-person registrations also get a copy of her latest book, The Burnout Challenge, signed by Christina Maslach herself. Find out more and register at www.psychhealthandsafetyconference.com. Now, on to this episode.
In our last episode, we discussed some of the protections and inadequacies of our current laws to protect the psychological health and safety of American workers. We'll talk about an effort that is attempting to address this gap with one of the leaders of the effort to establish the Workplace Psychological Safety Act up next on this episode of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast.
From Flourish DX, this is the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. As workplace mental health has become a global priority, there's a greater focus on addressing psychosocial hazards. Each episode, we look at psychological safety from an occupational health and safety perspective. Let's talk Psych Health and Safety.
Welcome to this week's Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. I'm your host, Dr. I. David Daniels, and I want to thank you for tuning in. Each week, we seek to increase awareness of the importance of psychological health and safety by learning from the lived experiences, research, and expertise of our guests, as well as advocating strategies to reduce harm and minimize vulnerability to psychosocial hazards in the American workplace. Section 5A1 of the OSH Act of 1970, or the General Duty Clause, requires employers to provide a workplace free from recognized hazards that are causing or likely to cause death or serious physical harm. It is difficult to argue that most, if not all, physical harm does not arise from first psychological harm. In fact, 30 countries around the world, including Canada, Mexico, Australia, and the UK, have declared through national standards and legislation that it is just as essential to address psychosocial hazards as it is to address physical ones. This is a portion of the testimony I had the pleasure of sharing with members of the legislature of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts a while ago. Bill H. 1882 would be the first such state-level legislation focused on psychological safety in the United States. So one of the drivers of the Workplace Psychological Safety Act is here to share about the effort to make workplace psychological safety as important as it is important as we place importance on physical safety. So let's start with an introduction of my guest by my guest with this question: who is Deb Falzoi?
Thanks so much, David. I am an activist, a coach. My background's in marketing, but I was bullied back in 2007 at a university in Boston and really could not believe that this was not already protected by law. And so I've been working towards trying to pass legislation with my marketing skills since then. It's been, I guess, over 15 years. And really a lot of it has been trying to educate people on what this is. I think in terms of who I am, I think I've always been fired up by issues of unfairness. And, I don't know if that's from being a middle child or, just seeing sexism from a really young age. And I after feeling like my personal workplace abuse experience was rooted potentially in sexism because the bully was only targeting women, although the bully was also a woman. Um, I really saw this overlap with discrimination and bullying and just how the social hierarchies get reinforced and maintained. And I really want to educate people on how we can disrupt that and how a lot of, you know, tactics for mistreatment, like false accusations, sabotage, verbal abuse, um, are are rooted in a lot of these isms and a lot of just positive and negative stereotypes to reinforce these hierarchies and to maintain power. So, and I've seen growth over the years in building momentum and education on this, and a lot more. Back in 2007, I really didn't even know what to call it, and then when I figured out it was called workplace bullying, I still didn't see a lot online about it, and now, like, every day on LinkedIn, I'll see, like, a ton of information about this issue. So, it's good to see this getting traction in the media, especially on social media. Um, but, it's been a long haul, and I think it, just takes time to really shift the political social discourse.
Yeah, it's that's interesting, that you've been in, quote unquote, the movement for such a long time, because I personally didn't know that there were folks out there that, that cared that much, that were working that hard. And I, like you, also feel that, we're at this point where it is becoming a much more common conversation to talk about these topics. So, and that's really what we're here to do, is to dig into a little bit of the history, how you got there, and some of the things that you've observed. But before we really dive in there, another standard question I ask everyone on this podcast is, what does psychological health and safety mean to you? When you hear that, what do you think about?
So I actually heard Amy Edmondson, who's a doctor and a professor at Harvard, talk about psychological safety this summer. And I just want to start off by reading what she calls psychological safety. She calls it the belief that one will not be punished or humiliated for speaking up with ideas, questions, concerns, or mistakes, and the team is safe for interpersonal risk taking. But to me, I see psychological safety as going a bit further than that. So beyond risk taking, we should be able to be accepted for, who we are, parts of our identity. We see this phenomenon happening a lot with high performers. It's not exclusive to high performers, but even if somebody's not risk taking and not, challenging their employer, although that is a huge component to this psychological safety or psychological abuse epidemic. A lot of people are not psychologically safe just because they're high performers, or um, their their competence and their ethics pose a threat to their manager, and especially when they speak up, which is where Dr. Edmondson's definition comes in. They get a target on their back for speaking up and for challenging the status quo, but they don't necessarily have to speak up and take those risks, in my opinion, in order to put themselves in harm's way and subject themselves to a psychologically unsafe workplace. So it definitely includes, this idea that we shouldn't be punished and humiliated for taking risks, but we also shouldn't be punished and humiliated for being hard workers, or for, being women, or being people of color, or, any ism, for being an older worker, or a worker with a disability, or a member of the LGBTQ community, or, there's, like I said, there's this huge overlap with negative stereotypes and bullying and mobbing. And so I think psychological safety really is about ensuring the psychological safety or the dignity of workers, regardless of whether or not they're speaking out.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I just could not agree more, particularly when you mentioned about the what being different from the group, how that can sometimes create a target on people's back or a target on their chest. It is this mindset in the workplace that the only way we're going to accomplish anything is we have to all do it exactly the same way. So we start to lose focus on what we're doing and get really focused on how we're doing it. And and I think that's an issue. I think that's an issue that's actually I heard a conversation. This was really during the pandemic. Of I think there were three Fed chairs who were on of the Federal Reserve Bank chairs, and at the time I think there was only one black Fed chair, and he mentioned that the fact that our economy has lost trillions with a T, trillions of dollars due to mistreatment, discrimination, abuse, uh, businesses not getting funded that probably should have just because of who the person was. And so we've lost out as a society, as an economy, as a culture, because if the idea is to make or build something good, what does it matter how different the person is that's contributing to that? Why does it matter? And I think it comes down to the security or lack thereof of the person who's in the position of power to make the decisions, to be quite
Yeah,
honest.
I completely agree with
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So let's just in general. Now, do we actually need a law in the U.S.? Because I'm sure you've got that from folks. Well, we've got a lot of laws, and do we actually need a law? So, how do you respond to people who question why we need a law?
I mean, I wish we didn't need a law. I wish that we could work together and we could collaborate and that we weren't, people weren't having their insecurities triggered when there's a top performer or somebody who speaks up or just they feel like maintaining their power, reinforcing their power. But because it's such a widespread problem, I do think that we need to regulate it. I mean, we've seen suicides from this behavior. We've seen, people can suffer from a whole host of issues from anxiety, depression, post traumatic stress disorder is really common with this. Um, you know, blows to people's self-confidence and self-worth, and then there are all sorts of, the like you opened with, the physical manifestations of this. People can get digestive issues, cardiovascular disease, cancer from the stress of what they're going through. um and then there's like the suicidal ideation piece of it, and then there's the financial harm when people are put in a position to choose between their health and a paycheck. And if they choose their health and leave the organization, then they can, lose their lifestyle. They may not be able to pay their bills. They might lose their home. Um, and then there's the social harm of not only the isolation in the workplace that often is a tactic to minimize the target, but also people who take that depression and anxiety home. That impacts their marriages, their relationships with their children. It has this huge snowball effect, and people's lives. We've heard so many stories of people's lives being torn apart by this issue. I've heard people describe this as an attack on their personhood. They're going in to just to make a paycheck for their families, and yet they're, going into work with all of this stress and anxiety, or maybe they're crying into work or feeling nauseous, and it's really a problem. One of the biggest problems with this actually is when, it's one thing to have one abusive boss or coworker or even subordinate, because upward bullying is also a thing. But it's another thing when your employer doesn't do anything about the situation, or retaliates and joins in on that false narrative to vilify you, to push you out, because their legal department is in their ear telling them that you've become a liability. And if they admit harm, then, they could open up themselves to a lawsuit. So, this even happens with actual illegal discrimination where people are trained to believe that their HR departments will, be empathetic with what they're going through. And then they go to report what they're going through. And because the because HR works for management and doesn't want a lawsuit, they will often construct a new narrative that vilifies the person complaining so that the person, deals with more stress to the point where they're either not performing and get fired, or they just can't handle the stress and they leave. So, um, really, what we see as a big problem with this is that there's no accountability for employers. Very often, they police themselves. The government isn't stepping in to say that they need accountability, and so there are these multiple layers of betrayal. First, by the abuser, potentially by coworkers subscribing to the false narrative, and then the employer not stepping in, and then society by way of the government not regulating this issue. um, they all add to these layers of betrayal to the person who was harmed by the abuse tactics. So, yeah, to the people, people with lived experience in this, I think, understand that it needs to be regulated, but people who don't, I think a lot of times it's either an education issue, or they might be not supporting it to maintain their own power. But because this has become such a huge problem, I think that's the reason that it needs to be regulated. People shouldn't have to lose their health, their entire work experiences, including their education, um, their homes, their marriages, their friendships. They shouldn't have to lose anything because they've reported a toxic work environment.
Again, the the point that you just made about accountability, I think, is really, 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 really important, because that's what, at least in my view, that's the reason that we have laws, is for a form of accountability. That those that the, sometimes the law is the only thing that can hold really powerful people and really powerful institutions to account, because they have enough money, enough influence, enough whatever. And often that influence is gained by bullying, by harassment, by threats, by basically using what I defined in my research, by using psychosocial hazards like a tactical weapon. And it's, some of it is done unintentionally, but some of it really is intentional. It comes out of kind of this old school command and control industrial revolution kind of leadership model that says, I know everything, I'm in charge, I'm all powerful, and everyone will bow when I walk in the room. And the in some cases, the only thing that could bring those kinds of situations, people, organizations into some form of accountability is going to be the law. And but on the other hand, there, you know, I think we're finally seeing folks who are starting to recognize, again, to your point, of all the harm that's being done to, even in intentional cases, because there is no form of accountability. You can do it basically and get away with it. You can't, it's really difficult to get away with poisoning employees. It's difficult to get away with, a building burning down and everyone in the building dying. It is difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult to get away with not planning for, physical kinds of things that happen to people. But you can still get away with the emotional damage, with the emotional wreckage left behind when people don't focus on how people are feeling emotionally. So, again, it's an important point. People do safety things for one of three reasons. Either they think it's a great idea, they think they're going to save money, or they have to. And that one's been taken off the table in the US because you don't really have to, which is kind of sad. So Talk to me, and you went into a little bit of detail, but I'd like if you wouldn't mind going into a little bit more detail. Was there a particular incident situation that motivated you to focus on this particular law? What caused you to go like, we need a something called a workplace psychological safety act? What is it that got you to that point?
I mean, definitely my personal experience, but then as I started to work on the issue from a marketing standpoint, I heard so many other stories from people where they talk, exactly what you just talked about, this like asymmetry of power where in a lot of cases they didn't even recognize what was happening to them. But even when we educate people or they realize on their own that this is an abuse of power and in an asymmetry of power, and they have no recourse for any of it, but yet they're so damaged by it. um I knew something had to change. I knew that the as I went through, in hindsight, some of the not only processes that I realized aren't working for people going to HR, going to higher ups, understanding that it's really that lack of employer accountability and having a ton of resources, like you mentioned, that keep people in these situations. But there's also this huge discriminatory impact. So we see this happening to a lot of women, a lot of people of color, a lot of people who aren't in the in crowd in leadership, um, or just don't have like the social power, like the social weight of their voice to impact changes. So, and seeing this play out in different ways in jobs I've had after this initial experience, um, I've come to see that a lot of the industries I worked in are notorious for having high incidences of workplace abuse. Areas like higher ed, education in general, but my experience was in higher ed, also state government, nonprofits, basically any industry where, we've seen people who want to do good and want to impact the world get really blindsided by people coming in who just want power and control, who might look the part of leader based on positive stereotypes, and who come in and wreak havoc. And these are also industries where the money to keep going keeps rolling in no matter how poorly managed they are. So tuition dollars will keep rolling in, taxpayer dollars, donations for nonprofits. I haven't worked in healthcare. It's the number one industry for workplace abuse. But people are always getting sick. Insurance money is always rolling in. So a lot of these industries, um, don't have to care about the people aspect, but yet, when we think about healthcare and education, um, the fact that these industries are so often so toxic has an impact on patient care and student care, and it trickles down to just how we relate to each other as human beings, and even relates to capitalism and how you know we keep putting or prioritizing profits over people. And when we do that, we lose out as people, but our businesses lose out too. I mean, there's also, there are studies that show that employers who care about their people, their workers as people, have better bottom lines. They have less turnover, less absenteeism, less presenteeism, where people are showing up physically to their jobs but checked out. They have fewer lawsuits. They have fewer workers' comp claims, and so there's not just the human argument to having accountability for employers, but also a business argument for it. Um, but yeah, I mean, the more I kind of have like dove into this issue over the years, the more I just the more clarity I get on just how this whole system is designed to maintain power structures, and how if we want to change that, because we're born into a certain demographic and we're paying the price for that, we need to collectively get together and stand up to it, because it affects so much of our lives. Like, this was affecting not just in my initial experience of, like, I had sleeping problems because I was ruminating over what was happening. But then as I went through my career, I realized that this is a problem throughout so many organizations. And if we don't address it, it's just going to keep harming people generation through generation. So to me, it's such a, um, like, the workplace really can show how the people in power maintain their power. And it's in some ways like the front lines of these systemic issues playing out. And if it's such a priority place to address these systemic issues, so that people don't have to suffer. So yeah, I've gotten a lot more fired up over the years after that experience. Yeah.
Do you need more psych health and safety in your life? Then head over to the FlourishDX Academy for several free on-demand e-learning courses. If you're an internal professional, follow FlourishDX on Eventbrite to register for any of our free fortnightly interactive webinars. Our flagship professional practice program is also exclusively available for internal professionals. The 12-week course blends theory, applied practice, and interaction with other professionals through live lectures and a monthly community of practice session. Find out more about all these learning opportunities or inquire about a bespoke in-house training at the FlourishDX Academy, www.45003.com. Now back to this episode.
Right. Well, again, so many important points. There are a lot of things about our society that we tend to only learn at work, and there are others that get reinforced there. And one of them, so I come at this conversation from an occupational health and safety perspective. And if you think about it, people don't tend to learn about safety in elementary school or even in high school or in college unless they specifically, it's, as I think about it, there's a lot of focus on, finance and, and other kinds of legal issues and, and supply chain management and all this other kind of stuff that's important. I believe it is. But, most of your business schools don't have a lot of conversation about, psychological health and safety or even about physical health and safety. It's considered to almost be a niche. And unfortunately, that mindset leads people into the business world thinking that it is all about the money over the people. And people are sometimes these disposable cogs that get tossed in, ground up, and then they go out and look for the next one. And, another of the points that you made is about how important it is that if an organization doesn't treat the folks that they see every day well, how are they going to treat me as a customer well? To include the public sector. I mean, most of my working life has been in the public sector, and our public services suffer because of how public workers are treated. Not only by the folks that employ them, but by the general public. It's all the things that we said were essential during the pandemic. The folks who couldn't work at a distance and all that, but then they had to go back to a work environment that was absolutely horrible. And and it's sad that that we all have to have these individual experiences. I had a similar one myself. There was a position I was driving to work in tears. It was so bad. But I kind of drag myself in there to do my job. And then I'm supposed to turn around and take care of the public, knowing all the time that I'm just being treated like trash. And so we all suffer. We all suffer, whether either directly or indirectly, by not addressing this. And thank God for folks like yourself who've, dived into the deep water to try to get this law passed. So can you talk about some of the components of the law some of it's the high points. It's pretty dense. There's a lot of information there, but can you give us some of the high points on how the law is constructed and what it's intended to do?
Yeah, the intention behind the bill is to first give people legal recourse who go through workplace abuse. So right now, if somebody experiences workplace abuse and they go to an employment lawyer, that employment lawyer will typically try to fit what they're going through into anti-discrimination law. And it doesn't always perfectly fit, but also the courts have pushed back on anti-discrimination law over the years, focusing on impact in the early years when it had, some teeth, to during the Reagan era, they focused more on discriminatory intent, which really raised the threshold for people to, have a, a claim. And so it's one reason why the social hierarchies haven't really been as disrupted as they should be. Um, so we want to focus instead on the intent piece of it and focus on the actual behaviors that are happening. I mean, when we're talking about things like false accusations, sabotage, verbal abuse, ill intent is kind of built into those behaviors. So, and it already has a discriminatory impact on people of color and women in terms of mistreatment at work. So, passing this bill would actually bolster protections for these groups, but also for anyone who's being abused at work. So the first kind of baseline is a legal claim for anyone who can prove that they were subjected to a toxic work environment as deemed by a reasonable person. And we don't want to have anyone have that almost impossible task of proving malicious intent. But we also don't want to wait for people to wait till their health is damaged to have a legal claim. And this actually is in line with sexual harassment law that says that there does not have to be psychological injury in order for there to be a claim of sexual harassment. So, we're pulling from existing concepts in the law to draft this, but the baseline is really what we're concerned with. But then we also want to plug up loopholes for employers. So we want there to be policies and training, but we don't want to leave it there because there have been laws passed that holds employers accountable. One in California for having training, and another in Tennessee for having a model policy, and they really haven't they don't have teeth, because it's one thing to have policies and training, but it's another thing to enforce those policies. So we've also included monitoring, or requiring the monitoring of the workplace culture through some sort of annual survey, but also we leaned heavily on the enforcement piece of it, so having guidelines around you know running investigations, and people don't have to use necessarily their employer's internal protocol, which is often rigged because they're policing themselves. So there's an opportunity to go outside of that process, through that's been the most challenging part of drafting this legislation, is really finding out or figuring out how to enforce it. So with the help of employment lawyers, we're kind of tweaking that piece, but we'll likely end up going through the state human rights commission, so that they can function as kind of a vetting agency for the courts, because this is such a subjective issue. Um, then employers will be required to coach, counsel, or discipline, including termination of the perpetrator if they find fault there, or if an outside agency finds fault with the perpetrator, so that we can really tackle that employer level piece. But there's this whole, and we spent some time really figuring out, well, how do we really address this systemic level issue, or the systemic side of this issue, because we really researched how anti-discrimination law is working or isn't working, and saw some research that shows that over the years with anti-discrimination law, the courts have really seen discrimination as a set of individual cases rather than a societal issue. So we also built into the bill a way to capture data around, how employers are addressing that piece of it. What are their attrition rates? What are their stress leave rates? What are their and there are separate bills about this, but what are the racial and gender makeups of their workforce? Um, what are the salaries, on a de-identified reporting of what are the salaries along race and gender, and all sorts of different data markers that will, you know regulate how, or basically encourage or get employers to report on these issues as systemic markers, hopefully getting that to be public information so that people, potential employees can make more informed decisions about who they want to work for. Um, and also considering this idea that, when employers don't take care of employee well-being internally, then those costs actually get externalized onto taxpayers when employees are working paycheck to paycheck, and then they, decide that their health is more important than their paycheck, and then suddenly they can't pay for their basic needs. So they're relying on tax money for, like SNAP benefits or their housing or TANF or, all these social services that essentially employers, because they're not addressing these issues internally, they externalize them onto taxpayers. So we want to put that back onto the employers by having them report on these specific data markers. So um, the legal claim to begin with, the processes that employers can put in place to protect themselves if they're dealing with a lawsuit, and then the more systemic addressing of the issue are kind of the three big factors of the proposed bill. There's a lot of details within that, but those are kind of the big overarching ideas.
Sure. You mentioned California and Tennessee, and again, I'm aware, and thanks very much for the invitation to participate in Massachusetts. Have you seen over the last few years? Have you seen other states or other states that are starting to see either progress in this area? I the only one that I know of that's actually passed that's close to this is in Puerto Rico, at least that I'm aware of anyway. So what's your view about what's going on around the country? Are we making progress in getting this law to actually become something?
So we worked on a couple of us have worked on a different bill that was that led to those kind of watered down versions in California and Tennessee. That bill had been introduced in, I believe, around 30 states in the country and is now active in about four. We have active bills, or have had active bills, for the Workplace Psychological Safety Act. I mean, it's a newer bill. We just drafted it last summer. So we have had bills in Massachusetts and Rhode Island, but we have a team in New York City. We have a team in Texas, and we're working on trainings for getting more states involved, training interested people on, you know, the details of the bill, how to find a lead sponsor, how to start to build a coalition. But Puerto Rican bill is really strong, and hopefully that will give us some leverage in the 50 states. There, like you had mentioned earlier, a lot of other countries have passed laws also on this issue. So um, we haven't seen a lot of traction yet, but it's also a very new bill. We have seen this bill passed the Rhode Island Senate, which was really exciting and hopeful. And just the outpouring of interest in introducing this bill in states across the country, I think we'll see a lot of momentum in the next couple of years in terms of um, getting more states involved so that we can, create this national movement. And, um, there might even be a piece of what I mentioned being introduced on the federal level. There's some interest there. Um, so there's a lot of promise and a lot of like things are moving quickly in ways we haven't seen before. So um, there's a lot of hope for this, and it requires a groundswell of support.
It does. It does. Yeah, I want to believe that we have the opportunity, and I shared this a little bit in the last episode, that because there are uh, there is the International Labor Organization and the World Health Organization and the U.S. Surgeon General and 30 other countries around the world have addressed this. There's an international standard, ISO 45003. There's all this stuff that actually didn't exist 3 years ago. Not most of it didn't 3 years ago, and now now with this draft, this law being placed into the discussion, I think we have the opportunity to move a little bit faster than even some of these other countries. It took them years. Canada has had a standard around psychological health and safety for 10 years. But Australia actually has the strongest law on the planet, and their most recent updates only about a year old. And a lot of this, I do believe, was triggered by our collective experience of the pandemic. A lot of people, figured out that you know I actually feel better, safer, and could do better work not going into that office, not going into that toxic environment, not, as they've had an opportunity to experience it, they have had second thoughts about wanting to go back into it. I'm amused by these discussions about we've got to get everybody, quote unquote, back in the office. With, it, and that kind of suggests that we actually knew people were doing good or bad work when they were in the office in the first place. Because a lot of organizations, they don't really have great systems to manage performance when people are physically present. And if I can do a job for 2 years at my house, why is it that I have to do it back in the office now? I mean, it's just a really interesting time that we're in. But all of these winds that are blowing, I think, can be they're going to be the wind in the sails of a law like this because more people are focused on it. Dr. Edmondson's work it's been around since 1999, but now people are actually paying attention to it. And so some of it really is likely about timing, likely about just the stage that we're in. So how do you even you've been working on this for a little over a year? How do you stay enthused? You said you've got a marketing background and all that type of thing. What keeps you pushing forward and driving forward to cause this bill to become a real thing?
I think I mean what you just said is spot on with like our culture being ripe for this. I mean, we saw like not just like the great resignation with the pandemic, but the Me Too movement, the Black Lives Matter movement, just people speaking up to these toxic systems. And, there's also like the great breakup that is coming out. And so the culture is motivating me more. But I mean, so often I get just personal responses from people saying, like, this has given me a huge sense of relief to understand this phenomenon or to see the abuser playbook. You know, a lot of people go through this experience and don't, we're so entrenched in the emotions of it, in like I mentioned, this like attack on our personhood, that it's really hard to get clarity on what's actually happening, not just from like the abuser level but from the employer level and the cultural level. So it's really, it puts more wind in my sails when I get these messages from people saying like your work has helped me personally get some clarity on what I'm going through. And then just seeing this momentum build with people. You know, we've seen more of an outpouring than ever on people wanting to get involved with this issue. People resonating with our talking points around, you know, the employer negligence side of this issue. And it really, the more I work on it, the more I see that not only is this helping people, but there's just this growing opportunity to really get leverage in state legislatures with the ultimate goal of leading to federal passage. So at the same time, even if we never pass a bill, our goal is to really educate people that this is a thing, so that they can detach from it, and we can, um, you know, use that kind of collective healing to help um, get get through this trauma, this like betrayal trauma that is workplace abuse. So, um, there are ups and downs with this work, and obstacles all the time, but those are really that feedback is really what keeps me going, and realizing we have to make, move the needle on this issue. I mean, no law is going to eradicate a problem, but I think our goal is really to focus on the preventative side, move the needle on safer workplaces, and really show people what they deserve. That they don't have to be part of this toxic system to the degree that they necessarily are, and there are ways to recover from it. So, um, yeah, it's a roller coaster, but definitely um, a lot of signs that things are moving forward.
Yeah, yeah, I do have to admit that I'm one of your TikTok fans, so I don't judge me. So, uh, but I wanted as a so just a couple more questions before we close out. So talk to me a little bit about uh, how you think about and come up with some of the things that you put out on social media, because we were chatting before we started to record, and it seems like you're doing this like 24/7, 365, because it's almost ubiquitous. But it sounds like it's something you just do. So tell me a little bit about the the social media kind of marketing that you're doing of the law and the work that you're doing.
Yeah, I think in the early days of our work, we really focused on just the basics of what bullying is. And as things have evolved, the co-founder of End Workplace Abuse that I work with really spoke up and leaned on the employer negligence side. And once we used that in our messaging, things really started to resonate with people a lot more. I think people, um, uh, to some extent over the years, have understood, or it's hard for me to say because I'm so entrenched in this and I feel like I live and breathe this issue every day, but it feels like people have a better understanding of the basics of workplace abuse. So my our goal is really to educate on more of the, kind of taking that one step above that and educating on more of the nuances of how this works, how the abuser playbook works, um how this really is a playbook, and how this, I think people, because it's such an isolating issue, that collective aspect and people understanding that this is an epidemic and there is kind of a pattern to it, that there's some sense of relief and detachment from what they're going through when they understand that, what I just went through is part of this, like, kind of formula that a lot of people are going through. Like, it just provides a lot of people with, yeah, some comfort and some validation, knowing that all of the gaslighting that they experienced, or the, like, internalized oppression from the system, is really by design, by people trying to reinforce their power. And I think the more people can kind of gain clarity on the nuances of it, the more they can that it resonates with them, that they want to share their resonating with some of these insights. But in part because they're feeling validated by it, and they're feeling part of this bigger collective action. So yeah, the thinking behind, I mean, things have evolved over the years, but the current thinking behind the messaging is really what's going to resonate with people. How can we help them understand this issue in a simpler way that, but isn't so basic that it's actually going to help them. It's actually going to help them understand um, that you know abuse is never about them. I mean, if they are a toxic employee or a low performing employee, there are ways to deal with that as a manager that aren't toxic. So, um, you know, understanding that the behaviors of abuse sit squarely on the shoulders of the abuser, and so a lot of it is that basic education of how this works as a playbook.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, as we close, if there are folks who are interested in learning more about the bill, who are interested in, perhaps, testifying and supporting it in their state, they just they want to learn a little bit more about this. How would they do that?
They can go to WPSAct.org, which stands for Workplace Psychological Safety Act, or they can go to workplacepsychologicalsafetyact.org. Both work. And they can find out, how to take even a small action to email legislators in the states we're active in. They don't have to be in that state to take action. They can also get more involved. We also have our group is actually called End Workplace Abuse. And so we have a website called endworkplaceabuse.com where they can take action on any number of issues that aren't necessarily workplace psychological abuse, but are forms of reinforcement of power from employers that will help us collectively move the needle on safer workplaces. So banning non-disclosure agreements that silence targets, bills around pay equity, wage transparency, protections for tipped workers who are getting a sub-minimum wage, or hourly workers who are dealing with toxic scheduling practices. So in, I think, every state but Wyoming, we were able to identify at least one bill that is currently introduced where people can take action to let their legislators know that they support whatever is being proposed. And then also, I think I mentioned this earlier, we are working on trainings for people to be able to introduce the bill in their state. So people can reach out at any time to get involved at any level. Every level helps. And we have roles posted on our website. So yeah, those are the two: WPSAct.org and endworkplaceabuse.com.
Wow. Well, Deb, thanks very much for taking some time out to share not only a little bit about your story, but the efforts that have gone into to getting this bill out into discussion and to continue this movement to create workplaces in the United States that are psychologically more safe and more healthy. So I just appreciate your time. So if you're watching this episode on the Flourish DX YouTube page, please do like, subscribe, share with your friends. If you're watching or listening to the podcast for the first time, welcome. I hope something that you've heard will get you to come back in the future. Previous episodes of this podcast can be found at psychealthandsafetyusa.com. We'd encourage you to become a part of the Psych Health and Safety USA movement by connecting to us on LinkedIn. And until we have another opportunity to share with you, please, take care of each other. Particularly take care of yourself. Be concerned about yourself and watch the environments that you're in. And look out for these resources that Deb's talked about to try to help you stay safe in the organization that you're in right now, or look for one that might be safer. So again, until next time, we'll look forward to another conversation on the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. Thanks very much.
Tune in each Friday for new episodes of the Psych Health and Safety USA podcast. If you have a story or know of one that needs to be told, reach out to us on LinkedIn or send an email to david@id2-solutions.com or go to the FlourishDX website at flourishdx.com. We'll see you next time.